This is a wrap-up of the third line of defense, acquired specific immunity. I'm going to link it to cell signaling and talk about primary and secondary response. So we've spoken about how macrophages from the second line of defense, which are phagocytes, can eat pathogens, display the antigens, and activate the immune system. We know that they activate helper T cells, which proliferate, meaning they divide by signaling themselves with cytokines and autocrine signaling. Then they can activate cytotoxic T cells and plasma B cells through paracrine signaling, sending the cytokines out. Okay. There are two lines of defense, or two kind of systems in place in the third line of defense. The first is the T cell line. This is called the cell-mediated immunity because what's happening is your cytotoxic T cells are killing infected cells. They're actually doing cell-to-cell signaling, and these cytotoxic T cells become activated by the cytokines. They can also become activated when they dock up receptor to receptor with an antigen being displayed to infected cells. So T cells kill infected cells, okay? And then we can produce memory cells as well. In the B cell line, they're activated again by paracrine signaling from cytokines. These are not actually antibodies themselves. These are TK receptors here. They can also dock up to a pathogen and become activated. And specific B cells and specific T cells are activated with specific pathogens. So in the B cell line, we're not worrying about infected cells. We're worried about free-floating pathogens, free-floating viruses, bacteria, etc. in the bloodstream, in the fluid in the body. So they disable infected cells. They disable pathogens directly, not infected cells, by making antibodies. Antibodies can surround a pathogen, disabling it because it can't infect anything because it's surrounded, right? Can't get inside a cell if you're surrounded. It can cause pathogens to stick together, kind of like the antibodies act like Velcro, sticking the pathogens together. And then that slows down the pathogen, causes them to agglutinate or stick together, and then macrophages can come and eat them. And antibodies can also send signals to macrophages and other white blood cells to eat and destroy the pathogen. So the first thing I want to do is link this to cell signaling and everything we've learned so far this year. So we did this before, but this is a basic B cell. Okay, so let's talk about cell signaling, and let's also talk about how this relates to the endomembrane system. So let's say this right here is the TK receptor. We know TK receptors deal with protein ligands, and the protein ligand we're going to talk about today is a cytokine. So the cytokine here is the ligand, and this right here is reception, right? The cytokine binds to the TK receptor. This triggers transduction inside the cell. Usually with TK receptors, you need two ligands. So what happens is that causes the two TK receptors to jam together to dimerize, usually causing phosphorylation of a kinase. So let's say this kinase has been phosphorylated. That kinase will phosphorylate two other kinases, which will phosphorylate more kinases, which will phosphorylate more kinases in a phosphorylation cascade. The last thing that is activated, probably by being phosphorylated, would be something called a transcription factor. A transcription factor is going to go into the nucleus of this cell, and it's going to bind to the area of DNA associated with antibodies. And this is where our response section starts. When that transcription factor protein that was activated at the end of this phosphorylation cascade, so we activated a bunch of kinases, and then the last protein to be activated was this transcription factor. When it goes into the nucleus, okay, it binds to the area of the DNA associated with antibodies. That allows for the production of antibody mRNA. That antibody mRNA is going to come out of the nucleus and bind to a ribosome on the referee. Then we're going to have translation occurring. Okay, we're going to produce antibody proteins at the end of protein synthesis in the referee. So here's the referee here. You can label it. You can label it right now. Then via vesicle, those antibodies that are specific to the pathogen are going to be transported to the Golgi. And then the Golgi is going to tag the antibodies and say, okay, you need to be exported from the cell by exocytosis. And then those antibodies are going to travel via vesicle to the cell membrane, where they're going to be exported by exocytosis. And all this is part of the response. And now we have antibodies in the blood and lymph that can destroy the pathogen. So that is the cell cycle. That is the link between signal transduction pathways and the endomembrane system and, the immune system in general. Okay, now, how does this happen more quickly if you've seen a pathogen in your body before? So let's look at that on the front of your big sheet. Okay. So let's talk about primary versus secondary response. This is really adaptive immunity, our third line of defense here. So what is happening in our third line of defense? Let's look at the graph. Some of you have seen this graph before, but let's just do a quick review. So let's say this x-axis is time, the y-axis is antibody concentration. Let's say this is first exposure to an antigen. This can be through infection, or this can be through vaccination. Okay. What happens is to actually create those correct B and T cells to get the antibody production up and running, your first response peaks at about 14 days. So it takes 14 days for your immune system to really peak, which means those viruses and bacteria have a lot of time to divide in your body and make you really sick. So this is your first response. Luckily for you, your adaptive immunity, your third line of defense, learns and makes memory B and T cells that are waiting in your bloodstream for secondary infection. So after 14 days, your antibody production declines, right? Because you're not as sick anymore. But luckily, you make some memory cells, right? And those memory cells exist in your body. Now, this is a break in the graph signaling like a long amount of time. And now let's look at 100 days. Let's say you come in contact with that infection again. Okay, so at day 100, this is your second exposure to the same pathogen. Luckily, your body has these memory cells. So what happens is your antibody production peaks at 7 days. Actually, more like, 4 to 7 days, okay? And it's a lot bigger. So your second response is bigger and faster. And then you carry more memory cells. So your body learns and doesn't get sick the second time. And this is where vaccination comes up, okay? Vaccines in general. In vaccines, they give you the antigen or part or a non-pathogenic part of a virus or bacteria. So you're given an antigen, a dead virus, part of the virus, okay, that's not going to cause infection. So these are non-pathogenic. They're not going to cause you to get sick with it, but I can't even read dead there, sorry. But your body can learn from these, okay? Your body responds as if you are infected. So this is your primary response here, like up there, okay? It takes 14 days. But the result is memory B and T cells ready for the actual pathogen. And this shortens the duration and severity of the infection. Okay. Now, that's pretty cool. I want to talk about a couple other things. I want to talk about autoimmune diseases. Okay, something I get a lot of questions about. Autoimmune diseases is when the immune system attacks your body cells, right? For example, in type 1 diabetes, your immune cells destroy the cells in the pancreas that make insulin. In type 2 diabetes, that's totally different. We'll talk about that later. Okay. In multiple sclerosis, which is often called MS, right? The immune system destroys your nervous system cells. So these are all examples of your immune system destroying cells that should be left alone in the body. So something is going wrong. Some signaling pathway is going wrong because these immune cells are going up to cells in your nervous system, or in this case, in your pancreas, and saying, these cells don't belong, let's destroy them. Sometimes that's genetic. Sometimes that can be caused by a viral infection. The cases of type 1 diabetes in children skyrocketed after COVID infections because kids that had really active COVID infections, or really anything, really active flu, things like that, can sometimes trigger type 1 diabetes. So sometimes when your immune system becomes overactivated, it can trigger these autoimmune diseases. Another example of an autoimmune disease is lupus, Crohn's disease. Yeah. Okay. Next thing I want to talk about, which I'm kind of running out of room for, but I'm right over here, is allergies. Okay. Allergies, kind of like an autoimmune condition, is when your immune system reacts to harmless natural stimuli in the environment. Right? So for example, pollen, peanuts. Your immune system thinks of these as invaders and causes an immune response, causing allergies. Sniffly nose. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between allergies and a cold, right? Because you have the sniffly nose. You're provoking that same histamine response for something that should not do that. So again, this is your immune system being a little wonky. The final thing I want to talk about is HIV. HIV is a retrovirus, meaning the genetic information in HIV is RNA, and it's reverse transcribed into DNA, so it goes backwards. And there's a special enzyme called reverse transcriptase that does this, that brings the RNA back to DNA. And one of the medications to treat HIV is to destroy reverse transcriptase, but that's neither here nor there. But why am I talking about it here? I'm talking about that here because HIV causes AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. How does it do that? HIV destroys T helper cells and macrophages, which destroys the signaling and coordination of your immune system. So it leads to AIDS because you die of a different secondary infection because your immune system isn't working. With that positive note, I'm going to end this immune system video. Thank you for watching.